So Dean McDonnell, you're very welcome to Bulletproof Dad podcast. How are you, sir?
Not so bad at all.
For people listening, just to give a little bit of context here, Dean is a doctor of psychology, and I'm really looking forward to getting into the depths of a conversation today, talking about human behaviour, but also the effects of these new technologies, in particular, like the social media, artificial intelligence, all these things that are coming at us now thick and fast over the last few years. So Dean, I think the best place to start before we get into all that meaty stuff is, can we talk about psychology and what actually is psychology, and how did you become a psychologist?
What is psychology? I think the answer will depend on who you ask, what kind of psychologist. So the best thing that I could probably argue is that if you were to break it up, ology, the study of things, and then psych would be the mind. So if you were to kind of break it up a little bit more, it's the study of the mind, behavior, that kind of stuff.
Cool.
Depending on what type of psychologist you ask, if I'm more the academic route. So I did do a bit of time working with children at risk of dropping out of school in Dublin. But if you were to ask a counselling psychologist or a clinical psychologist or a forensic psychologist or an educational psychologist, there's quite a few different types. And we all are trained in the same thing. So we're all trained in human behaviour. Some more than others. Like obviously if you do an undergrad, you have particular types of training. And then as you get more in depth in the education, you have different types of training. So that's understandable. But then we all have different purposes. We all have different roles. We all behave a little bit differently as well. Some of us might focus, again, primarily on children. Some of us might focus on other things. So my interest has always been developmental psychology. So working with children, working with kind of older adults, and then how things like technologies influence that. So I'm really interested in what we're going to talk about over the next kind of 45 minutes to an hour. And hopefully give you guys a little bit more insight into a bit about my background and what I've found over the time. Because that's kind of what I'm interested in.
Cool, man. I'm looking forward to this. So I suppose what you're saying there in terms of human behaviour, like I'd imagine a lot of that comes down to what goes on in our brains. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah.
So can you kind of give us an idea of like a really layman summary of what's going on in our brains? That's a ridiculous question to ask, I'm aware of, but if you can, do your best with
it. Like having listened, I'll try and put it into context. So I would imagine lots of people listening to this would have listened to the previous podcasts, like the previous ones. So a lot of the time when I was listening, you were talking about how people were trying to get in the zone, and you might have been trying to kick something over the bar, or having a love for the game, or the graph for the game, for example, came up quite a bit. So nothing happens in isolation, just to try and get your head around that. So you might experience a really high level of happiness at one particular point, but at the same time, you might be a bit hungry, or you might be a bit fearful, or you might be doing, like, there's a lot of stuff going on at exactly the same time. But one of the problems is that we only really focus on one thing at any given time. So like there's unconscious things that we're always thinking of. Like, what about your breathing? And you probably weren't thinking about your breathing there for a couple of minutes, but now you are. Yeah. But what's really funky about that is that in about 10 seconds, it's going to go. You're not going to think about it anymore. I can still taste coffee in my mouth, for example, and I'm now more aware of it. Don't know what kind of beans they are, probably Arabica. But in about 10 seconds, gone. So you're always living in the moment, and that usually lasts for a couple of seconds until something else comes in, and then you're thinking about something completely different. So there's always this cycle of change, and you're always aware of the present, which is fine. But all of the things that we're not aware of are going to influence your behavior in some shape or form. And that's one of the fears that comes up around technologies, is that we're bombarded with lots of sensations, lots of stimuli, lots of smells, colors, all of this kind of stuff, but we're only paying attention to a fraction of it. So when we start thinking about like, what is this influencing, or how is this influencing, where we might be a bit fearful because we don't really understand it.
Okay. So I think like you said about understanding, I think that's perfectly normal where we're all at, because we're seeing these new things coming at us thick and fast at the moment, and the rate of change and development in this sector is just off the charts, like it really is. So bringing it back to what you're saying there, like looking at, we're trying to focus on what's going on at this moment in time. Is that just because that's all we're capable of processing in our brain? Like why is that the case?
We can't think of any more than one thing at once. Okay. So trying to get back to it as well. So if you can imagine you're on the 45 line, trying to kick the ball over a bar, and there's a huge audience. You can't escape that. You can try and block it out as much as you possibly can, but you can't. You can try and minimize as much as you can, but again, you can't. You're always going to be aware where you are, what you're doing, and it's always going to be there. So trying to minimize as much as you possibly can to focus on one thing, but it's really, really, really hard. It's really tricky to stop that. So yeah, trying to focus on one thing is really important, but we can't parallel process. As soon as we start dividing our attention into multiple things, we make mistakes, always. So if you can imagine, texting and driving shouldn't do it at all, because your attention should be on the road. But as soon as you look at your phone, or as soon as you even having a conversation with someone beside you, your attention is divided, and that's going to cause issues.
Okay, so bringing it back to 100% get what you're saying there. If we were to go a little bit deeper with that, could we break down, again in layman's terms if possible, what's going on in there? Like, is there a mix of chemical releases going on in our brain? Is there certain hormones that are at play here when we're trying to concentrate and minimize things? What's actually going on under the bonnet, if you like?
We have a lot of things called neurochemicals.
Yeah.
So ones that you might be familiar with would be things like dopamine or serotonin or oxytocin. Like they're all a noradrenaline or norepinephrine, I think is what the Americans call it. Or adrenaline. Like there's all of these things that might get thrown around and say, yeah, we're tapping into our adrenaline now, your fight or flight, or then freeze is another one. They all have different purposes. They all do different things, and they're all perfectly natural. Our body creates these. Our body goes into overproduction as well during puberty in trying to create an awful lot of these because we're not fully developed yet. So male brains, female brains, and using those kind of binary constructs, we kind of release more testosterone, for example, and then we grow an awful lot more. We get taller. Our voice might crackle or break. So there's a lot of things that go on at particular time points. So perfect. That's grand. However, they again all happen in parallel. So you might get incredibly fearful, but at the same time, you're still trying to understand who you are, or try to develop or form your own identity. Like there's so many things that are happening in parallel that you cannot separate one from another. So with serotonin is one of these chemicals that make you happy. It's in huge layman's terms. If you're feeling a bit down or upset, it could be something got to do with your serotonin. If you are feeling very unmotivated, that is generally referred to as emotional regulation. So being able to regulate your emotions. So that's usually dopamine. They work together. They are mates, like they do shake hands the odd time. So usually when somebody is upset, we might be like, okay, it might be serotonin, it might be dopamine. We can try and figure that out. So we could do like a blood test, we could do loads of other stuff to try and figure it out. But again, those levels change on a daily basis, hourly basis. As soon as we eat something, it's kind of similar to food. Like our blood sugars take it in, we get a release of different types of chemicals. That happens perfectly naturally. If somebody can't develop their own serotonin, or if it's very low, what we might have to do is give them something like an anti-anxiety medication, or to try and increase synthetic serotonin. Or if it's regulating your mood, it could be dopamine. So even some of your listeners might be even taking some of these for various reasons. So then we have things like adrenaline, which is usually associated with like fight or flight or unbelievable feats of like pulling up cars or weightlifting or any of this kind of stuff. But that's also associated with things like fear or anxiety, and that if we feel fearful, our happiness level drops pretty much incredibly fast. So our serotonin drops down, and then all of a sudden, all of this attention will fill up the bucket, so to speak, of adrenaline to kind of prepare us to run. But what happens is, if you ever feel that kind of mass, or even after a game, you might have tapped into your adrenaline in some shape or form, where your body says, look, we need adrenaline to keep us going, you'll be knackered afterwards. You'll be really tired. You might be very irritable as well, keeping in mind that your body has just produced a lot of adrenaline, lots of other neurochemicals. You'll be emotionally spent. That's why you might need to sleep afterwards. So there's a huge balance, and it is a knock-on effect. For every experience you ever have, there is a huge knock-on effect afterwards.
Is it like for every action there's an opposite reaction? Like
pretty much, yeah.
Something I remember reading a book before called The Big Leap, and there was an element in that where it basically had a theory that we all have like an inner thermostat, that we all kind of crave some sort of equilibrium. So if something really good happens to us and we have this massive high, you can bet your bottom dollar that there's a crippling low coming soon enough after to bring you back down to equilibrium
100%.
state. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like if you have too many Barocca, as soon as you stop, it's gonna shake you a lot. Like you're getting a lot of synthetics, and as such, it's going to have an effect afterwards.
So like another real raw example of this, I remember Tyson Fury, the fighter, saying when he became heavyweight champion of the world, achieved his lifelong ambition, woke up the next morning and he just couldn't get out of the bed, not because of the fight, but he just was flattened. Yeah. Like just felt empty, I think was how he described it. Yeah. So knowing what you know about the human brain and behavior, that's perfectly normal.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And like trying to get out of bed in the morning, we know that is dopamine.
Mm.
It's most likely because you had a rough night's sleep. And we always, even with a lot of my students where I work in the Southeast Technological University in Carlow campus, some of the first things I ask my students is, did you sleep all right? How'd you sleep? Because I know that if students haven't slept for whatever reason, obviously doing all my assignments, they're not going to be able to pay attention.
Yeah.
And how I manage the class after that is going to shift. Mm. So I might throw in a couple of YouTube videos, sit down beside them and say, look, is everything all right? How are you keeping? Like, you can't push people further than they can be pushed.
Yeah, yeah. We actually used to have a few lectures in UCD, and at the start of every lecture, to just be some outrageous clip on YouTube or something, just play for 2 or 3 minutes, just to kind of settle everybody down, get everyone in good form, and then bang, straight into the lecture then. Could be completely irrelevant, like could be like the clip of the poor fella slipping on the ice that comes around every Christmas, something like that, or whatever else. So again, that's just that person, the lecturer just trying to get everybody back into a good mental state to be then able to absorb what's about to come at them. Yeah. That'd be a tactic of yours as well.
That's one of my many tactics.
Cool.
Yeah.
So you mentioned there about, like, we've mentioned dopamine, we've mentioned serotonin, and just to kind of finalize on those, they're what we call neurotransmitters. So that they're messengers. They go to the brain to then kind of tell us how we feel, and how then the knock on how we should behave. Is that fair to say?
Like that is fair to say. They're the chemicals. How we then act on that is controlled by other, like our emotion, for example, would be controlled by the limbic system. So they're kind of like this is what you should do. So like having loads of serotonin isn't necessarily a good thing either. So we know that really high levels of serotonin is something that's in some way linked with things like schizophrenia. Okay. Low levels of serotonin is mixed, is kind of associated with things like anxiety, or things with mood dysregulation would be dopamine. So our bodies are fantastic machines, and they know exactly what needs to happen at any given moment. You might get cravings, for example, like chocolate milk after going to a gym session. Your body might need magnesium, and that's for some reason a really, really nice kind of, our body knows what it needs, and it regulates all the time. So neurochemicals are one aspect to it, but how you yourself kind of regulate those, which is down to kind of things like not necessarily just personality, but your brain through your limbic system will manage and control your behaviors.
How many years have we been like this as a species?
Probably since the beginning.
Okay.
I remember in one of the previous podcasts we were talking about like reptilian brains, that kind of stuff. Yeah. I think it was 320 million years ago was the most common ancestor between, and then we divided into birds, reptiles, and mammals. Yeah. The primates are pretty much similar, very, very similar. We'd have very similar brains, similar functions. Our prefrontal cortex, so that bit at the very, very front, that's pretty much what makes us social. Yeah. Most mammals have a very active prefrontal cortex.
So how long ago since we fully kind of developed that prefrontal cortex?
This is one for a neuropsychologist.
Okay. Are we talking thousands of years?
We're talking thousands.
Okay, the reason I'm bringing it to that is just because we've had a huge change in society over, well, it's constantly changing and evolving, but a huge disruptor of our life over the last kind of, I would say 15, 20 years has been these new technologies coming in. Absolutely. So that's where I'd love to go to next, and kind of talk a little bit about these, and then we might link how this is affecting what's going on in this melting pot that we're talking about. So like, you've kind of transitioned, you mentioned there that you originally worked with children, and it was to do with kind of helping kids, support them and limit them from dropping out of school, which again is a fascinating subject and at least one podcast in itself, I'm sure. But if we were to go now to your kind of your newer line of work that you're doing, like looking at technology and how it influences our behavior, like what do you be looking at now? Are you looking at the last 20 years of the introductions at social media side of things, or are you looking at stuff kind of before social media came along? For televisions, for example, in the 1950s and 60s, or
it's kind of a bit of both. It's one of these difficulties of you can't look at things in isolation. Otherwise, you'll only find what you want to find. It's that kind of confirmation bias. Yeah. If you only look for the things you already know, what's the point in doing it? So technologies have been around for donkeys. Like they've been around for so long. It was only like within the last 100, maybe 150 years, where books were the devil. And they were burned.
Yeah.
And now, and then there was the Industrial Revolution, machines are replacing, and all of a sudden we can do other things. But at the same time, what people don't seem to realize is that when books were invented, that gave birth to a lot of human creativity and lots of advances. Industrial Revolution, again, gave birth to a lot of creativity and a lot of time where rather than using a machine to dig up your garden, which I spent all day yesterday doing, it took me all day. So with a shovel. But the quality of the work was infinitely better because I was able to get rid of all the big stones and do all this kind of stuff. And again, manual labor, which is grand, but I would have missed the kind of enjoyment and the self-fulfillment of all of this kind of stuff. Because again, all of these neurochemicals are still existing. So when we're using technologies, the way we behave can often differ. But a lot of the time, it might be different to what some of your listeners might be thinking. So if you can kind of go back to the work that I would have done with a lot of the children. So I would have worked in inner city Dublin, the 3 post-primary schools, 6 primary. It was very rare that any of them would come to me and say, look, I'm having a problem with this technology. Or I'm having problems with this, or like any kind of digital media or digital tool or any of that kind of stuff. It was all real world problems. Like I'm having issues fitting in, or I don't understand, or why does this teacher not like me? And then equally, I would have worked just as much with the teachers as I would have with the students. So there was a kind of a real world kind of disconnection between what I was reading academically by saying technology is taking over and it's destroying mental health and it's doing all of these things. But then on the ground, I was like, I'm not seeing that. So technologies, they're fantastic. I love them. My phone is currently nearly touching my elbow. Like I'm a really big fan. But how you use them is really important.
Yeah.
That's where the issue is.
So I think this is what we're going to go into now. We were talking off air and you mentioned you had kind of 2 studies that you've been heavily involved in over the last while. So maybe this would be a good place to go next and kind of talk about, because again, we probably need to pick some form of technology to establish some context here. So 2 studies you mentioned to me was one on, they were both based on screen time. Yeah. So one was based on how screen time affects our activity levels, and there was another one on how it affects our mental health. So if we were to delve into both of those, I'll let you choose which one you'd like to go for first. I'm going to talk a little bit about this, what you did and the findings behind it.
The sedentary behavior one is, I was the lead author on that. And it kind of answers a question that I didn't answer a couple of seconds ago. Like how long back would I have to look for to try and get information about how technologies influence behavior? Generally, my rule of thumb, and one that is shared with a lot of colleagues, would be 10 years. So if we think about 10 years from now, would have been 2013, which is after the Mayans predicted the end of the world and all this kind of stuff. So it was actually relatively recent in the grand scheme of things. Like I think Facebook
would have been the superpower then. 10 years ago,
like the iPhone was released in 2007. Trying to look for anything before that would be kind of not useless, but our handheld devices were infinitely bigger. We wouldn't have fit them in our pocket. And that wouldn't have changed their behavior all that much. Like it might have. I'm more interested in the more current stuff, in the more kind of, I don't even know what new social medias exist now because they change almost on a weekly basis. Like TikTok is a couple of years old now at this point. And lots of other like Instagram and Facebook, they've kind of adopted a similar shorts strategy. But then we also had Vines a couple of years ago, if you can remember those.
Yeah, true, actually. Yeah.
And they were quite short and snappy as well. So nothing kind of comes from nothing, to kind of mention King Lear. So there's always this kind of, we're building upon our past in some shape or form. So we're trying to see what's happening and what's going on. So the first study that we did, myself and colleagues, we were really interested in things and trying to tackle the question of, does technology influence or does screen time increase things like obesity, or does it increase things like sedentary behavior, like just sitting still, or and how does it impact on our executive functions? So the sedentary behavior bit I really, really liked, and it was a group of researchers from the Sedentary Behavior Network over in the States, and they've international base as well. But they looked at sedentary behavior from a heart rate perspective.
Okay.
So it was things like sitting easy, resting. Then there was another one, being physically active, or then stationary. So stationary, sedentary are 2 slightly different things. They're associated with different forms of metabolic rate. You'll be able to talk about this an awful lot more than I will. But they are slightly different. And one thing that we were stumbling upon in all of those articles was that very few of them were talking about your metabolic rate. So you could technically, on paper, be watching a really intense bit of media, But the way our brain works, we're incredibly visual. If we see an explosion on TV, our brain is going to process it as though we're experiencing it. And the only difference is that we don't feel the heat. We don't feel the atmosphere of the situation. We're just being controlled by what we're seeing. So we actually might experience a spike in heart rate and you might even feel if you're looking at a horror movie, you're looking at an action movie, your heart is pumping. So you're actually burning more because even though you might be stationary, you could be sitting, you're burning more. So what about video games? If you play things like Resident Evil or The Last of Us or any of these kind of action-based games, you will experience heart rates. So what's going on here where, okay, these papers aren't talking about measuring heart rate because why would they? Because people are sitting in the same place. Next of all, they might talk about very different types of games. So there are some games where you might be driving, which is fine, but then there's lots of overlapping where like, what about airplane games? Or what about flight simulators? Or what about any of these kind of things? So I know it sounds incredibly nerdy, but we were trying to answer that question of why are we hearing one thing, but not really reading it in academic papers? So we looked up, I think it was about 16,000 studies that we're looking for. We did a massive kind of systematic review, which is like a study of all of the studies that were carried out to try and look for these. Our main focus was we had to have 3 conditions. The first one was, and again, I apologize for this being very nerdy, but looking for any form of sedentary behavior. So that had to be mentioned and measured, which was really important. The next one was any type of screen media. And when you think about it, phones, Fitbits, anything that has a screen, we included. And then the last one was executive functions. And this is one that I didn't really define or anything at all, but our executive functions refers to things like our ability to solve problems, our raw processing power of our brain, our attention, being able to regulate your emotions. So all of these things about executive functions, they had to be measured in some way. So we found, I think it was 6.
Out of 16?
Out of 16,000.
Okay,
I think it was either 6 or 8.
Right.
Very, very small number. And we were kind of shocked that there were that few. So despite there being a huge, like very significant vocal screens are destroying everything, very few studies actually carried out direct measures of that. So we were able to split them up in a way by younger children who were being carried out or college students that were being involved. I think it was 2 and 2, which we just got lucky, or was it 3, 3. So one of the older adult sample one of the older kind of studies was using older adults, and they were on bed rest. So they were literally lying down in a bed within a hospital ward for various reasons. And they were talking about using a kind of like a tablet that was projected then onto a screen. We were also given a measure of the screen. So how big the screen was. Was it HD? Was it whatever kind of definition it was? Lots of other previous studies didn't do that. So you could be looking at something that was very pixelated, that was very like, I need to get as close to the screen as possible. Like how far away from the screen also is going to have a bit of an indication. A lot of the studies didn't do that. So there was like 15,900 and whatever. They weren't mentioning any of this. And I think that was the biggest outcome from that study, was that, look, we need to actually start conducting research where we talk to each other. Like researchers need to talk more to try and figure out how can we actually carry out research when there's such a big impact that the media can then take on board by like, this causes this.
From the 6 that you did actually delve into, so like what were the conclusions from it? Because again, I think it's easy to say, oh, when you're looking at a screen, you're sitting on your ass and you're being sedentary. But you're talking there, we're actually going beyond that. We're not just looking at movement, we're looking at actual heart rate. And if heart rate increases our metabolic rates, we're going to burn more calories at rest. So what were the findings from those 6?
They were inconsistent.
Okay, right. Okay. I was hoping you'd say that.
Yeah. So it's bizarre. So think back even to yourself, and the way that I kind of try and navigate it is,
can I ask, why were they inconsistent? Is it just it's such a hard thing to measure because there's so many layers to what's going on?
Like some of them are using a mix of different phones. Like within research, you need to be as consistent as you possibly can to be able to kind of compare the findings, compare the results. If you only use iPhones, that's fine. Perfect. If you use an iPhone and a Galaxy, that could be different, because I know back in the day they used to say that like Wi-Fi routers will automatically go towards the iPhone as opposed to the Galaxy, or there might be some technological specifications, or the screen might be slightly bigger or smaller depending. If they're not exactly the same, you can't compare them, because even a couple of micro differences, microseconds in a response, could mean the world to a finding. If you're doing anything in sports, for example, and looking at reaction time, a couple of seconds could be the difference between a win or a loss.
Yeah. And even with that, like I think the key we were talking about there, how it's defined is screen time.
Yeah.
Like what you're physically looking at on the screen can vary drastically depending on what you're into and what you're watching and what social media platform you're on, who you follow on that platform. There's so many layers to it. So just to say screen time, again, like it could be a productive thing you're watching or chewing gum stuff you're watching as well. There's so many layers to this. The second study then, if we bring you to that, so we're saying that first study was just found so many, it was inconclusive in general. Between 16,000 studies, only 6 kind of fit the criteria, and even with that, the results findings were inconsistent. Okay. How was it on the second study we were talking about there and the effects on mental health? Were the findings similar?
It was quite consistent again. So this was being led by Chris Ferguson, based over in the States, and Linda Kay, based over in the UK. And fantastic researchers. If like anyone is inclined to look them up, go for it. It was very much a balanced paper. I think one of the critics and one of the criticisms that we got from that paper, which I really focus on, and we generally always focus on the negatives as opposed to the positives, but it wasn't qualitative, or there were no qualitative kind of aspects of the study. And I was like, no, this is definitely a next step. We need to actually talk about people's experiences as opposed to just focusing on the technologies. Some of the findings and some of the studies that we found in this one, which is a meta-analysis as opposed to a systematic review. So a meta-analysis is basically where you look at the individual findings of the studies and then look at the data that was collected, look at the results, and then try and compare them using kind of statistical techniques. Again, it was quite consistent. There was no kind of cold, hard kind of this equals this, because you can't look at things in isolation. So at the very start of the podcast, we were talking about how different types of neurochemicals are released at different times, which is fine. That study that I mentioned first, the systematic review one, we were talking about how methodological issues are everywhere. That if you're not using the same types of devices or questionnaires or even the languages. So a lot of the studies that we were using, most of them were in English. And that's quite ignorant to think that only studies are written in English. Again, it's considered to be more of the academic language. Some countries, they are bilingual, multilingual. They might not have access to particular phones. So do we exclude that from the sample? And then what kind of an influence then does that have? Some questionnaires, if it was written in English or American English, is that going to have an impact on the actual scores? So what is happiness or what is well-being? That could differ depending on who you ask. And even if you asked me 5 minutes after waking up this morning, I would have probably rated my happiness as being quite low. But then on the way here, I was like, yeah, this is going to be quite cool. So my happiness would have increased. So time of day is a big impact. So all of these inconsistencies we found, and all of the kind of methodological issues of what size of the screen, what tests, what scales, all of this kind of stuff, we again found. So there were some studies that kind of suggested that too much screen time could reduce patterns of sleep. Again, that it makes sense. If you're not sleeping, you're going to be a bit more irritable. It can increase kind of food consumption. Again, if people are going on binges and just watching Netflix for hours, that can also have a bit of a negative influence. But again, it kind of neglects the fact that some people were watching movies with a group of other people and they were chatting and they were talking and they were having a great time because it was the social element as opposed to anything else. And that's one thing that, again, we picked up on in that systematic review, was that a lot of these studies don't talk about the social element of these tools, these technologies. So when a child is playing a computer game, you can see it as playing the computer game, but you're not necessarily seeing it as a group of friends hanging out when they weren't able to, or if like after hours or when it was dark outside, in the safety of their own home with a group of other people. So it's the tool is really important to try and navigate and try to figure out how that works. But yeah, I think we were afraid of it more than we should be.
Okay, well, I think where I'd like to take you next is we mentioned Facebook there, so we might go into the social media side of things, because something we see regularly now, if you go scrolling through, more so on some maybe Facebook is probably the one that has more of it than others. You see these big headlines from whatever, like again, scientific study finds screen time above an hour damages your child's brain, whatever, like that could be the headline, for example. We've just kind of broken down two studies there, and the conclusion from both was that the findings are quite inconclusive.
Yeah.
So you've also mentioned there that if you go into this with a little bit of wanting to find something you're a little bit biased in your opinion before you start, you will confirm what you want to confirm. Yeah. So with that in mind, we go onto social media and we see these big headlines, and we see certain pages, and a lot of pages that share this may not even have anything to do with this.
Yeah.
But again, we hear the term clickbait. So could you potentially kind of give us an idea of what clickbait is, and then also why does it tend to be negative or startling headlines that tend to perform best in this manner?
We tend to be drawn to things that stick out. Like if you're walking through a shop and you see like a red sign with big letters, you might see instantly sale. If it was colored red, sale, this is half price. Or if the label is slightly different, this must be an offer. I must get it. So we are drawn to things that stick out. Clickbait is basically a statement or something that the computer thinks, I know, bear with me there, the computer thinks based on your previous patterns of behavior that you will be interested in and that you will click. So clickbait is basically something sensational that you will click onto it, and it will try and motivate you and encourage you to click it. The kind of the rapid scrolling is the other aspect to it as well, where clickbait isn't just one thing. It could be a list of different things that, again, the primary aim is to make you click and stay on it for as long as possible. Realistically, all forms of social media is a business. The way they get money is advertisements, and that's something that you can't really neglect either. So I know there's the marketable age, that kind of stuff, but the more you use something, the more it starts to realize your patterns. And that could be really useful in some ways, like Tesco or Aldi or Lidl or any of these kind of shops. Based on if you scan your club card or whatever, they say, oh, we noticed that you buy bread. Well, here's 10% off the next time you buy bread. And that might sound great, perfect. But when you transfer that idea into a completely different context, like social media, it's, oh, they're learning about me, and this might not be for the good or for the better. But realistically, they're trying to show you things it thinks you might like, or the programmers think you might like. And that can work sometimes, or it can go horribly wrong the others.
So we're talking about programmers there. So if I'm a programmer for a particular social media company, my vested interest is to keep your attention on our platform for as long as possible. The more attention we have, the more we can leverage our advertising. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely.
So we also then, going back to the clickbait example, we also see it where certain pages might do this. So it's a page has the vested interest in getting clicks onto the page. And again, for the same principle that our website gets this amount of clicks, so this increases our value of selling our advertising space. So we have a vested interest in getting people to click on our page. Is that the reason? Is there? I suppose the question here is, why is it that most, in my opinion, from my observations, most clickbaity stuff tends to be the sensationalist stuff? Is it because it creates curiosity? Is it because it creates maybe an anger within us or an upset, and we're more likely to click that rather than happy news? Do we tend to more go to the negative rather than the positive? And is that kind of a vested interest that's going on at the moment?
Kind of, yeah. Like there was a researcher many years ago, I think it was Gottman, but they were carrying out research on relationships. And what they found was, I think it was referred to as the four horsemen of emotion. So again, can't remember directly, but what they were saying was, for every 4 happy events, or for every 4 positive experiences, it'll take 1 to throw them all apart.
Okay.
So we're always trying to look for, well, not necessarily always trying to look for negative things, but they always stand out to us an awful lot more than most. So whenever we see something that kind of triggers our attention, because again, if we're in kind of like a negative mood to begin with, we're going to be programmed more so to look for negative things to try. We don't want to get any more negative than we already are. But again, if you're working at home, if you hit your thumb with a hammer once, you're more likely going to hit it again because you're aware that you've done this before. So you're thinking about it too much, and you might actually hit your thumb with a hammer.
Okay, because you're thinking, don't do this,
don't do this, don't do this, and all of a sudden, smack. So we are kind of drawn to more negative things as opposed to happier things. But knowing that, you can try and change your mindset a little bit by saying, okay, I know that I'm focusing on the negatives. You're not going to think about that at the time, but we need to try and add more happy events, or we need to try and do something a little bit more positive or constructive. And that doesn't happen as we're scrolling. that could be very, very challenging to do.
But no one, in terms of what we're talking about here in the social media side, the social media companies, and particularly the companies who are looking for the clickbait, they don't really have a vested interest in us being happy, do they?
Not necessarily. Unless you have like I can't think of the word. Positive. Anyway, I can't think of the word at all. An altruistic kind of media individual who wants people to be happier.
Yeah.
Like there are some examples of games, or like Journey, for example, was one game. And the primary aim of that game was to just travel the world. And like there was no negativity, there was nothing. It was just sensations and experiences. So there are games that are developed by programmers that are referred to as serious games. And the idea behind them is that they're trying to elicit emotion, and you're trying to elicit positive emotion. And we use them quite a bit in therapy. So we actually do use video games for therapeutic reasons. Again, it's a tool that you can use. So like one of the games that I was playing before, with a group of children that were tense towards each other, should we say, to put it lightly. We played a game called Lava Girl and Water Boy. And again, this was a co-op game. If you can just imagine a keyboard in front of you. One child was using the WASD controls, so like up, down, left, right with those keys. And the child was sitting down beside them was using up, down, left, and right. So these kids could have been literally beating the heads off each other in class or in the yard. And then I had to kind of support them in trying to navigate some kind of common ground. The second I put them in front of the computer, that they had a shared goal that they had to try and resolve. And they were using these. And then a couple of weeks later, the teacher was saying to me, before this actually happened a couple of years back, that they had sleepovers afterwards and they were playing this game.
Yeah.
So,
just by bringing them together on a common goal.
Yeah. So that wasn't a game that was specifically designed to do that. So again, a lot of these social media platforms, they're not designed to make people happy, but how you use them is really important. So you might have a couple of like private Facebook groups or shared groups or something where you might be able to interact socially.
In general, when we're scrolling on the homepage stuff, like where we'd see the clickbait stuff, that tends to be quite a personal experience, doesn't it? Because we're in our own little world here, and it's just us with the phone and the screen. Yeah. So we wouldn't really have, like, it's where I'm trying to come from with this is that I'm just trying to bring people's awareness to maybe what is going on, and we hear the word trigger a lot.
Yeah.
And again, like if there's this thing going on here where people are going to be triggered, it's just trying to maybe heighten their awareness to it, because when they see these things, they're less likely to get involved.
Yep.
Like, is there anything that stood out to you on the clickbait side of things where you've kind of gone, God, this is maybe getting a little bit out of hand? Something in your own personal experience, like what platforms are you on yourself? Like, what would you use yourself on social media wise?
I would use quite a few. A lot of them is to understand them. So I'm on TikTok, not the TikTok, Jesus. I'm on TikTok. I take TikToks. There are like even just like Facebook, Instagram, on WhatsApp. So I am on quite a few, and the academic ones, like
for
LinkedIn
research purposes. So you sit there watching TikToks all day for research.
Absolutely, those like infinite dog teas, kind of. Yeah, they're fantastic.
But you can get, particularly like the way it's gone with Reels, like I find myself sometimes like checking something on my phone, and 20 minutes later, you're like pulling yourself out of this black hole. You're like, what did I just do there for 20 minutes? Looking at, like, again, some of it's entertaining. I don't know what it is. Like, I couldn't even tell you half the stuff I was looking at. It's amazing how it just can get a grip at you.
Do you think that it was kind of giving you some kind of release of dopamine?
Absolutely. Like, it must have been. Like, there was some reward pattern going on in my brain to keep me there and keep me there. And I think that's what we go back to, that we talk about dopamine, we talk about serotonin and oxytocin. Like, is there people like you sitting down with these companies and helping them create this thing? Like, in my world, the nutrition world, like, I know for a fact there are certain junk food companies and snack companies who sit down with food scientists. They develop the perfect mixture of sweet and sour and salt and put it all together to create these processed foods that we keep going back for, where the reward pattern in our brain wants more and more and more. Like, I know there's a certain crisp manufacturer who's perfected the perfect kind of snap when you bite into the crisp. And again, there's a reward pattern there. So is it basically similar what's going on in the social media world at the moment?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Like when you walk into a supermarket, you're bombarded with senses. We know research has shown consistently that you will spend more money if you walk into a supermarket hungry. Like, without a shadow of a doubt, if you're hungry, you're going to pick at stuff and you're going to probably get something for now and then also something for later. If you go into a supermarket and you're not hungry, we can try and make you hungry. And the way that we do that is by really fresh, vibrant fruit. Even the way that we say things and put them on it, like that alliteration of the language, even the language that we use can influence your behavior in some way. The smells. Have you noticed that when you walk through certain shops, you will get a smell of freshly baked bread? And that smell is an enticing kind of, oh wow, I really want that. I'm going to get it.
How does this work then in the social media world where we don't have the benefit of the smell, for example? What would they go? Is it all visual stuff they're trying
Visuals.
to Yeah.
Things that the programmers think based on our past use, we might realize that we're very invested in a particular area like sports, or like, did you hear about whatever's after happening in the news related to certain sports people over the last kind of few days? And we're like, oh no, I didn't click. And it could have been a story from 2 or 3 years ago. So I like some of these might be auto-generated by different programmers or different companies. But again, it is designed to keep you there, because if we keep you there, we can show you more.
Is this where the likes of these big data centers are now coming in? Are they essentially just tracking our behaviors and trying to perfect what they can offer us based on our previous experience? Is that to an extent what's going on? I'm sure there's more than that, but
yeah, it's not as, I think there was a really good book by Ben Goldacre that was basically, I think you'll find it's a lot more complicated.
Yeah.
But yes and no. So that's a very standard psychological kind of grey answer. It is designed to help processing. Like a lot of walks of life now are becoming digital to a large extent. Like over the last couple of years, the only reason why we actually still functioned as a country is because we could move things online.
Yeah, we were heavily reliant.
Very heavily. And that wouldn't have happened if we didn't have data centers. So it's almost like, yes, there's a lot of negative media about electricity and all this kind of, and prices going up and where it's being diverted and all this kind of stuff. But again, your ATM card is being controlled by certain data centers. Like, we use a lot of digital things in our daily life, and it's needed for it to actually function properly. So whenever you're looking at a video and all of a sudden you see that buffer sign, we might get very frustrated because we're seeing the buffer. We might need more data centers because of that buffer. So
right.
It's something that you might need to reflect on a little bit. So it's not just one thing. A lot of things are happening in parallel. So it's quite, you can't get overly negative seeing the buffer, but then also have the same argument of so many data centers.
I get you, yeah. The two completely contradict each other.
Yeah. And there's many, many, many more layers within that as well. So that's just one little example. There's an awful lot more arguments that you could make.
Like, I was talking to someone in the gym the other day. It was mentioned that I was having you on to have this discussion, and he was making the point that, like, when he was growing up, he'd like 10 or 12 stations on the television, and like you'd sit down and something would look absolutely terrible, but you just sit and watch it, and you might actually get into it after a while. You give it a bit of a chance. Whereas like that phenomenon now is just gone. Like, my daughter is 3.5, and she's watching something on YouTube, and as soon as the ads come on for a split second, it just the hissiest of hissiest fits happens straight away. And skip the ads. I think it was like one of our first words was skip the ads. Skip the ads. Frightening when you think about it.
Yeah.
Like, do you see this now playing a role? Because we're getting used to having so much more stuff then and there. Like, patience always was a virtue, but it seems to be getting less and less prevalent now. And as we go forward, is that something you're seeing?
So I'm gonna take you back a couple of years. In 1956, there was a researcher called Miller. Well, that was a surname. We generally just use surnames. 1956, and he came up with this magic ratio of 7 plus or minus 2. And the idea was that we're only capable, or the human brain is only capable of retaining 7 items of information plus or minus 2. And what that kind of refers to is, on a good day, you're going to remember 9 items of information. Okay. And on a bad day, you're going to remember 5. So the average there is 7. So mobile numbers, for example, are 7 digits if you take away the prefix. Yeah. It is everywhere. And that was designed by a psychologist or by a group of psychologists. You have then the kind of reels. You have scrolling. If the ad comes on to break that attention, you're like, what the hell? I was getting into that, and it was only 3 or 4 seconds long. Our attention span is limited, very limited. If something breaks our attention, it's broken.
What's the average attention span when you're scrolling on? Like, I hear reels, we're talking about this. Like, we do reels for the gym and stuff, and we're trying to get our message across through reels because nobody's like reading stuff anymore. like we're always talking about like hooks, or how do we get the attention in the first, like, is it a 2-second rule, 3-second rule, 5 seconds? Like I've heard people say even that like goldfish tend to have longer attention spans than human beings do on their phones these days. Like,
Yeah. There's no rule of thumb, and it is changing. And again, it could differ depending on age.
yeah.
So like I can't give you an answer. Like there might be an answer for your gym or for the people that attend your gym. And that's most likely.
I train dads, so they've no attention span whatsoever. Like, you're talking minus seconds here.
So it differs. Like if I was to give you a number, or if I was to give you kind of an idea, and we have, generally it's considered to be 3 types of memory, right? So we have kind of sensory memory. So that's kind of memory that we perceive through our senses. And again, we have vision, sight, and like other ones that you might never have heard of as well, like proprioception. So it's your body's ability to see itself. And that's a really funky one if you want to look up later in terms of going to the gym and kind of like your identity, that kind of stuff. It's a really curious one.
Is that so how we see ourselves and how we see other people, how they see us as well?
Yeah, it's a really...
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
really
it's deep, like, yeah.
Because sometimes it's distorted. Like we don't see ourselves as having enough muscle, or again, our body will see itself. Anyway, I have a couple of funny anecdotes, but I'm not going to get into it now on this one.
Well, I'll give you one about distortion, because I think, again, going back to the social media example, I think it's just something that's just so fascinating, because we're all on it in some way, shape or form. Like I think back to being on Facebook when I was younger, starting out as a personal trainer, and we would have followed these experts, you know?
Yeah.
And like I remember thinking like all these experts were in an absolutely incredible shape, and I was only like in my early 20s here. And it was only just out of perspective as I got a bit older and learned more and more that most of these guys are taking all sorts of steroids and drugs to look the way they do. But for that moment in time when I was kind of younger and naive, I had a completely distorted view of reality and what I should be. I was lifting weights and I was eating my protein and doing my nutrition right, doing all the right things, and wasn't anywhere near that these people I was following. And the issue was these guys, I turned out in hindsight, which is a lot of the health and wellness experts out there, which is kind of frightening and ironic in a way, are taking this sort of stuff. And they're obviously, some are honest and some aren't. And the guys who aren't saying anything, they're kind of using their body as a vehicle of selling their program or their product, whatever, and kind of leaving out one huge element of the truth. And as a result, then I was thinking back going like, that's me in my early 20s. Like, thank God I didn't have access to this when I was even more naive, younger, teenager, or even whatever age kids go onto social media these days. Like, it really is a melting pot, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. Like the good thing about having technologies now. So I would have, again, grown up, I think we're roughly about the same age as well, like looking at actors and looking at how like incredibly muscular you can get. Like I'm thinking of Christian Bale, for example, from The Machinist and then The Batman. Like he increased massively. Yeah. But now you have kind of reels or you have shorts of actors spending about 3 or 4 months in the gym constantly trying to get that way. And like before we would have only ever seen the outcome and not the struggle to get there. So we're like, yeah, I want to be that person. But you didn't actually see how much work they actually had to put in. You only ever really see the outcome. But now technology is kind of used. It's given us a bit more private access to a certain extent.
Yeah, kind of behind the scenes.
Yeah, of how difficult that body actually is. And sometimes when you don't see that struggle, you're like, well, how did they get that body? Like, how do they actually get to that level of physique? And so there's always a con to every pro or a pro to every con. Like, there's always multiple stories that you could actually discuss. But like, I fully appreciate that completely. Like, it's...
Well, I just think because a lot of people listening to this probably have kids on social media and or teenagers, or maybe they've kids not on it yet, but they're kind of worried where this is going. Like, if you're in the same boat where you had, say, a 12-year-old child who is looking to get on TikTok, for example, and they want to download it onto their phone, like, what's in your head here, knowing what you know? Like, I think realistically, if it's a daughter, for example, she's going to get on there at some point anyway. So saying no is probably not going to last very long. So what is kind of the conclusions you come to here? Like, how do you regulate this, or how do you guide your child and, I suppose, protect them to an extent of this big bad world that we're all getting? We don't know much about. Any studies done on it have proven to be inconclusive. Like,
look, I'm just reminded. Like last week, one of the things that I told my students was that we're trying to prepare kids for a world we haven't a clue what it's going to look like.
It's a good summary, really.
Isn't it?
Think about it, like,
So, but there are things that we can do that we know works. So we're trying to develop their base or their core skills. So that whole idea of survival of the fittest, or what Darwin was talking about, all this kind of stuff. It wasn't necessarily survival of the fittest. It was the one that was the best adapted to change.
Yeah, I love that quote.
It's so good. And like that was something that
we've seen that in COVID big time.
Yeah.
The last couple of years, people who adapted to the change.
It's really important, and then people get that slight difference. So if we were to prepare for the changes, kids can navigate anything. Like they will bounce if they're able to change and accept you're not going to get this right all the time. So how can parents or guardians or whoever, trust is really hard to get, but incredibly easy to break. So like there's loads of apps that we could suggest, like, oh, don't put this app onto your phone or do this or that. But if you do that without consulting your child first and they spot that could immediately break trust, and all of a sudden they're probably going to go around you. Like there are times when you will need to just have a chat and talk and say, look, what are you using? How are you using it? And like obviously don't just say, what are you using? How are you using it? Like there is a discourse surrounding that. So you do need to trust them, and they also need to trust you as well, that you will again give them privacy, give them space. If a child is going to come to you with an issue, they're probably going to come to you. I think there was one statistic that mentioned, I think it was done by the National Anti-Bullying Centre, but that parents were only aware of things like bullying half the time, and teachers were only aware of it, like I think it was 60% of the time, something like that. So the way we might see something as being bullying, children might see it as being kind of aggressive. So a parent's perspective, again, might be a little bit more focused towards the negative, because as a human, you're going to probably try and defend yourself from negativity, but you're also latched into your child as well. So you're probably going to try and defend them.
Big time, yeah.
So just be aware of all of these things that are going on in parallel, but trust is really important. Communication is latched into, again, that idea of trust, like sitting down with your child, even for dinners. Like it's really important to maintain as positive a relationship with your child as possible. Like before we used to think, or psychologists of the day used to think that like children that came from different types of families were going to struggle, or that's not really the case anymore. Like there was a time when divorce was one of the worst things that could possibly ever happen to a child. But now we're realizing as long as a child is developed and grows with love, that is by far the biggest indicator of child success. So there are certain things that we know that kind of supersede an awful lot of these factors. And again, when I worked with children, and even I've colleagues that are clinical psychologists that work with children daily, weekly, Mark Smith being one, and myself and him would have carried out some research before, and he was saying that, yeah, like most of the time I meet children, they're talking about real world issues. They're talking about, I can't fit in. I don't know what's going on inside my mind. I don't feel like whatever's happening is actually happening to me. Like there's so many things going on. Technology is it's very low on the list of I need help. So I think what we're going to struggle with, or what we might think is the problem, probably might not be to the child. So communication is incredibly important.
Okay. I appreciate your summary on that, because I know there's going to be a lot of people, like the vast majority of people listening to this will have young kids, and like that. What was the sentence you said again? It just was really profound. We're trying to prepare our children for a world we haven't a clue, a future that we don't know what's going to be.
We don't know what's going to be.
Yeah. Like when it's put like that to you in clear as day, it's like, okay, there's no wonder that there's such confusion about this. And fear, it's fear of the unknown.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
And what's really difficult is that parents might be looking to the scientists for all of the answers. We don't know. Just as like some of us are parents, and some of us are trying to actively find the answers to all of these questions, but we don't know yet. Every time, like research takes a long time. So, for example, it can take upwards of 3 months for us to get ethics to carry out research.
Okay, yeah. And there's a lot can happen in 3 months in technology.
And like even updates, if you're thinking about how many times your phone has to go through an update, like it happens quite a bit. So it can take 3 months, but we also have to actually develop the study in the first place. So you don't just go to an ethics committee and say, this is what I want to do after a day of thinking it. It's a long list of kind of what's the proposal? What are you looking to do? What exists? Have you any funding for the research? And that's another big issue as well, that if we had more funding, would be able to get an iPad into the hands of everyone and be able to kind of look at it and see what's going on.
Where would that funding come from? Because like, you know, these big tech firms are massive employers now in the world, and I'm sure they have some sort of a vested interest in not proving themselves to be harmful to human beings. You know?
Yeah. But so what if it was shown that it was harmful? we don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
So it could be
but
like
would
that.
a firm be willing to take that chance or put themselves in that situation?
Possibly not, depending. Like there's that kind of social impact aspect. Like Google has
And this isn't just the tech sector. There's other
like
sectors
so
where
many
we
other
can
sectors.
question the same
Again,
thing as well.
Like when I was working in the schools, I had contacts in Google that I didn't know initially, but they did things like coder dojos, and they were doing so many fantastic things. Like some of the children I walked from particular schools around the Google area in town to the Google Center, and the kids, their eyes were like, oh my God, this place. They didn't understand any of it. Like, why are they sitting in beanbags? Why is there can we have those chocolate bars? And they were like, can we work there? And like, those are some questions I was like, oh man, that's hitting me straight in the feels. Like some of them were getting by day to day, but then when they were like, these guys are making games, but they are to a certain extent, but they're actually programming, they're coding. So you're trying to build their self-esteem, build their confidence. And some of the children that would have been very, I get that a lot of your listeners will be sporty. I was more the music and the kind of computer nerds.
I have a lot of those in the gym as well. We do.
Perfect. They're my ignorance completely. But like, it's just that idea of, I have a place. I could potentially be doing this as well. And that was like, I genuinely miss working with the children because it really opened my eyes to what's actually going on. But yeah, it's a fascinating area.
Cool. No, one final one we've just seen come up a lot lately is the emergence of AI, artificial intelligence. And now I'm conscious, someone like yourself who is a lecturer in university, like I can go on to ChatGPT now and ask it to write me an essay on whatever assignment you've given me the day before. Like, where is this going to go for the likes of universities and colleges? Because this is going to be an almighty disruptor, really, isn't it?
It's going to be an almighty disruptor in ways. We're fairly astute. Most of us are anyway. So generally what a lot of people don't, or what a lot of students and people that aren't in that kind of sphere, we tend to notice writing styles very quickly. And we do talk to each other as well. It's really funny when myself and colleagues chat and we're like, did you know that this student isn't coming in like because of whatever reason? Oh no, but they were in my class. Or why is this student not submitting? Is everything all right? Like we have tutors, I'm a year head, for example. And if there's any issues, they'd come to me, or any problems would come to me. But there are times during exam boards where we sit down and talk about each individual student, it takes hours. If we spot inconsistencies, we might dig a little bit deeper. And you might say, well, what's going on? And then that's where we use programs like Turnitin, which will probably strike fear into the hearts and souls of anyone who knows what it is. It's a program that we use to look at text matching. So if you were to say copy and paste something from Wikipedia and put it into your assignment.
Still do that back in the day.
Yeah, look, we have something for that now. So it will flag and say, yeah, look, this is a bit of an indicator. If you had a sibling that did exactly the same course as you and were given exactly the same title, and they said, here, look, here's my essay, we can also track that as well. So there are little things that we can do from an AI perspective like that. Like it's artificial, yes, but it is like a machine learning program. But we also know writing styles of students. Like we will know on average, like this word or this phrase or this definition is far too advanced for a first year. Like they have literally just done their leaving cert. How do they know what all of these factors and kind of neurotransmitters are? Or how do they know what the limbic system is? Like we haven't gone through that.
How could you disprove that though? Like
it is very difficult. So what we might do, we may not be able to disprove it at all, but we might watch it a little bit more, and we might. Well, here's a bit of a flag. Let's just stick with it and see if everything. It might be genuine, genuinely. I have had several students that were absolutely unbelievable. But I might have watched them a couple of times just to see like how are they engaging in class. And I was one of the quiet students, that didn't do very well. But at the same time, you notice patterns of behavior. And you might say, okay, well, this student hasn't been in any of my classes, and then all of a sudden is belting out an absolute A++ assignment. There might be something here. Let's look at it over time and see what happens. So one of the really cool things about the AI program, like ChatGPT is one of them. It's really good at filling content. Like, so it's great at like content is here, but it very rarely generates new ideas. And so initially when I heard about it, I was like, look, my job is on the line. Is it? Maybe. But then when you start looking at some of the transcripts, you're like, it's not advanced at all yet. Like it will give you a lot of content and it replicates an awful lot of other words, other sentences, and you're like, there's a lot of repetition in this. There's no actual new information. Like, where's your ideas? Where's your kind of critique? And the way the human brain works at the moment, it's probably the brain in general is one of the most advanced systems in existence that we're aware of. Nothing is as complex as the brain. And then the human brain is another one that we focus on a little bit more, but brains in general. But there's no replacing that yet at all. So just to dispel some fears, the program creates fantastic content, far too kind of repetitive. There's no critical aspect to it as well. And again, one of the main kind of ways you get points in an essay is, can you critique that assignment, or can you critique or show some new development or new creative ideas? How can you do this differently? And they're the actual things that we're looking at.
Yeah.
But that can't do it.
Okay.
Yet.
It's fascinating like that.
Yeah,
It's kind of like going through everything we spoke about there. Like, I think to summarize, we spoke about, like, we understand ourselves, what we know of our human brain and the different neurotransmitters that are working with each other and against each other. Like, that's a whole melting pot in itself, and it can be stimulated by so many other factors, not just when you have a phone beside you, you said, or you're watching TV. There's so many other things going on in the room as well, the time of day, where you are, your climate. There's all these variables, you know.
Did we talk about melatonin? Melatonin is another really funky one.
Okay.
It's looking at screens at nighttime.
Yeah. So just give us I know it is, but just give maybe for our listeners
really
a definition of what melatonin is.
Melatonin is a particular neurochemical that helps you wake up. And it's one of these systems that's been around for years, thousands of years, but bright lights will wake us up. So it stimulates the production of melatonin. So if you were to sleep in a bedroom with the curtains closed, completely blackout, you might actually sleep for an awful lot longer. So our body will naturally start waking up when melatonin starts developing. So when the sun comes through the lights, hits your eyes, even though they're closed, it can still get light. Our body will start producing this and we will wake up. Caffeine will help stop, it actually increases the production of that and other things. But screens at night will have an impact. I know I think we briefly chatted when we had some correspondence before this. Blue screens, there's no real difference. Any kind of screen, any kind of light, even the light from a book is going to create small amounts of this melatonin. So there's no difference between reading a tablet or reading a book at the moment.
Okay, right, yeah, it's fascinating because again, like you're told, avoid tablets, avoid screens, read a book instead.
The light from the book will go straight into your eyes.
Okay.
Well, the light from the light shining onto the book will reflect, and it will also wake you up.
Okay, right, it's fascinating.
Sorry, yeah, but again, there's loads.
There's so many there, and then like we talk about the studies we've spoke about there. Like again, they've just proved it's too hard to say anything with a matter of fact just yet because there's so many variables to this, both in the actual studies and then also in what's going on around us in our environment. We bring it down. We're talking about social media. Again, it's a melting pot that's changing all the time. It's updating all the time, and as you said there, I think the biggest issue we have, we're kind of on the back foot because by the time we can get into a scientific study to look at this, the whole game has changed and updated. Yeah. So, and I said, I really like the summary you said there. We're like, but those of us that have young kids now, we're worried about this because it's a genuine, we have this initial fear of the unknown and we're trying to prepare our kids for a world we don't know what the hell it's going to look like. So if you are listening to this and you are a little bit concerned, or you've been enlightened on a few things, like what's your kind of summary or advice to people who are listening to this kind of going, okay, and I'm aware of a few more bits and pieces here, but I haven't got the certainty maybe I was hoping to get, which, let's be honest, it was never going to happen on one podcast about what all this is going on. But what would be your kind of advice to particularly someone who has young kids and is kind of thinking about the future?
I would be critical. Use your best judgment. We've been raising kids for thousands of years now at this point. If something doesn't seem right, maybe question it, but also question everything. Like, I'm not talking about putting on a tinfoil hat. That's not the case at all. But it is just a matter of communicate with them. Like, if you think your child should be on a computer for hours and hours and hours, maybe look at it. Do you sit down and have a meal with your child? Like, there's so many psychological things you could be doing, just being aware of technologies that's being using. If you don't know what technologies your kids are using, ask them. Like, rather than trying to go around it, just ask. If you don't know how they work, ask. Like, half the amount of battles that you could probably overcome is just by asking them. Like, if you don't know how something works, or if you're unaware, ask them to show you how it works or create something together. And again, there's this kind of oxytocin aspect that you're building your relationship further. You're getting something out of it. They're getting something out of it because my parents are interested in me and what I'm doing. And it's a win-win. So try to use what they're using, even if it's not like, I'm not a pro at this at all. Just a workable knowledge would be perfect.
I think it's gone back to what you said there about trust. Like, again, meeting them where they're at and having the conversation. I think the old school approach of telling them you can't do this and can't do that and can't do the other, I think kids are just too smart and they'll just find a way to work around.
It's fantastic.
Said, whether we like it or not, it's going to be a part of our future going forward. Dean, listen, I just want to thank you so much for your time. Like, again, we could go on for hours here, but this is absolutely fascinating. Like, even just like we spoke about there, the work you've done with children in the past and stuff like that could be a potential podcast for the future. Again, it's absolutely fascinating, but it does tie in really well with what we're talking about today, because I said that the vast majority of people listening to this would have young kids, and I think most people, when we talk about technology, they're aware of a few bits they're doing themselves, but I think when we talk about the fears of technology, it comes down to what their kids are looking at and what they may be exposed to in the future. So I just want to thank you so much for your time, and I know everybody listening to this will take huge value from it, so thank you.
Cheers. Thanks, Wayne.